Good morning. Welcome to lesson 9. So, this week we are working on submitting the rhetorical listening essay and editing it for submission. Over the past 4 weeks, we've been working on this paper. In lessons 5 and 6, you did some guided brainstorming in the discussion sections. In lessons 7 and 8, you worked on writing the paper over the course of 2 weeks with getting feedback from me. And then now we are moving into lesson 9, in which you should have a complete rough draft or at least a pretty good solid rough draft. And we're going to work on polishing it up and getting ready for submission. So, looking at this assignment, you'll be revising, editing, and proofreading your rhetorical listening essay in order to submit the final draft. And as you finish the essay, consider the following. You want to think about revising, which involves focusing on the paper's development and organization. A lot of times, students think that getting a paper ready for submission means checking the grammar and checking spelling, making sure it's formatted correctly, and then turning it in. And really revising and the writing process is a lot more in depth. A lot of times the paper changes and becomes better the more you revise it, the more you fine tune it. And so revising is kind of a global look at the paper. You're standing back and looking at the development and the organization. So when you're revising a paper, you're looking at, for example, the larger organization for the paper. Introduction with a lead in, background article reference, thesis statement. You're looking at the discussion sections, topic sentence, explanation, example from research, significance. Then you're looking at the conclusion. And I've left some suggestions on how to write a conclusion. But revision is essential and it requires time and reflection. That's why we spent 5 weeks working on this paper. And it's not something that really, ideally, you should be doing in just about 30 minutes and then turning it in. It consists of thinking critically about your arguments. How are they structured? How do you account for your readers' needs? And what support or research do you include to illustrate those arguments? It's important then to write your papers well before the due date, so that you have time to focus on your text development and organization. So, for those of you who've been meeting with me this week in conferences, hopefully what you're seeing is, if you'd have turned in that rough draft that you had last week, it probably wasn't the best reflection of the work that you could do in this course. But with a little guidance and a little feedback, you could make the paper a much stronger artifact, a much stronger paper that meets the requirements for the assignment. Editing is different from revising. Editing involves reading your paper at the sentence to sentence level. So we're going from larger to smaller, right? We're condensing, we're kind of zeroing in. So this time you're focusing on style and grammar and mechanics. So in lesson 8, you were really focusing on revising after the conferences and after feedback from your classmates at the global level. This week we're working on editing, where we're looking at it at the sentence to sentence level. You typically kind of look at the larger issues before zeroing in or zooming in on the smaller issues, because if you focus on the sentence to sentence editing early, you might just kind of end up spinning your wheels and wasting time because you're editing text that you'll eventually cut out anyways. Now, that's not to say that that won't happen, right? I one time wrote over Thanksgiving for my dissertation, I wrote 20 pages. And I was I didn't spend time with my family. I went out and I really kind of hunkered down. I sent my kids away to my parents' house and I just wrote. And then in the final product, I ended up having to cut all 25 pages because they just didn't fit with what I needed to do in the dissertation. And so while it can be challenging and frustrating, that's a part of the writing process. Because also, if I hadn't spent that time really kind of focusing on how to talk about what I was focusing on or what I was writing about, I wouldn't have had the vocabulary to talk about it later. And so it's a part of the process. It can feel frustrating, don't get me wrong, but it's also what makes you a stronger and better writer, is kind of wrestling and learning to, work those moves. Think about it like learning to play tennis. It can be really frustrating to do drills and to do the same kind of swings, or if you're playing basketball, to use the same kinds of, to practice the same kinds of shots over and over and over. But then when it comes time to perform, right, and to actually execute in a game or in a match, you're much better prepared because you have this kind of rote memory, this kind of understanding of the text or the game in this case. So we're working on editing this week. We'll also be doing a little bit of proofreading, right? That's kind of where you're looking for typographical errors, extra spaces, periods, missing words, that kind of reading. So some strategies to help you revise and edit your papers include starting early. That's why we've been working on this paper for 5 weeks. We didn't just kind of assign a paper and then tell you to go do it. Because it's challenging to get perspective if you're hurrying to finish writing your paper, much less trying to edit it and proofread it. You want to also step away from your paper, and that's why you need time also to start early. You want to write a complete draft. You want to walk away from it for a couple days. Clearing your head and revising the paper with fresh eyes will help you spot weaker sections and sentences. And don't think because if you're writing a smaller paper, you have, or if you're writing a shorter paper, you have less revising to do because you have, say, only 500 words to convey your point. That means that you really only have 500 words. So every one of those really needs to pack a punch. It's important. And so you don't have a lot of time or space to kind of find your way or to kind of elaborate in a way that isn't as concise and as specific as possible. You also want to utilize online and textual resources like the Purdue Writing Owl, the Colorado State University Writing Studio. You also have your textbook, you have spell check and grammar check. I would encourage you to download Grammarly as an app or as a plugin for Google Docs or Microsoft Word. I use Grammarly all the time. And not because I'm not a good editor or I'm not good at proofreading, but it just makes it so much easier for me to see places where, I might be, kind of phrasing words or phrasing sentences that are difficult to understand. I pay for the subscription service to Grammarly. It's well worth it. I wish I'd had it when I was an undergrad. So if you're thinking about if you're really committed and motivated to be a stronger writer, I highly encourage you to subscribe to the paid subscription to Grammarly. If not, I would download the free option. I use it all the time. It's super helpful. It really just kind of helps identify errors and give suggestions and tips to improve your writing. That doesn't mean you want to carpet, kind of accept all of the revisions or the suggestions carte blanche without thinking about it, but it does give you a time to kind of stop and look at the text and go, no, that's exactly what I meant to say. I'm not going to accept that suggestion. Or you look at it and go, oh yeah, that is actually really wordy. Let me see if I can unpack this sentence and add a period and make it a little bit more reader friendly. You also want to get outside feedback. So remember, we have an on-campus and online writing center. So you want to submit your paper and get feedback from the writing center, whether it's face-to-face or online. It's always great to have an outside perspective. Or you could ask your friends or your parents to read your paper and offer suggestions. Now I'm going to put an asterisk here because students do this all the time. They'll say, I had my parents read my paper and they said it was fine. Or my friend who's an English major read this paper and she said it was fine. I don't understand why you said this. And I will tell you, it has happened to me as well. My son is a senior at Texas Woman's, and my husband's also an English professor. We looked at one of his papers and we gave him some suggestions to make it better. And then he went to a conference with his instructor, and his instructor was like, no, this is absolutely not the right direction to go. And so my husband and I had to kind of take a moment, kind of take a step back and go, we're just going to let you work on this and not give you any kind of recommendations or, suggestions to improve it, because it happens to us too. So you want to keep in mind that you are the writer of this paper. You've been sitting in this class. You supposedly have been watching these videos and reflecting on the lessons. And so while your friend or your parent might have some suggestions, they don't typically understand the nuances of the assignment because they haven't read the This I Believe essays. They haven't listened to us talk about rhetorical listening. And so typically they give feedback for grammar and mechanics, which is fine. But if you'll notice the rubric, grammar and mechanics only make up a very small portion of the assignment. Development, organization, insight, that's the primary focus of this paper. That's 75% of the grade. So while, sometimes students will get their mom and dad to read their paper and then they'll turn it in and it really doesn't meet the requirements for the assignment. And then they get really frustrated because they're like, well, my mom said it was great. And I was like, well, I'm sure it was great to your mom, but you don't have any research, and that's a requirement for the assignment. And so you just want to keep that in mind as you're working on your papers, whether it's in this class or in another class. So here's what we're doing for this week. We are going to read Editing from the Hub. We're also going to read from This I Believe, essays that focus on arts and letters. You also want to read from the Writing Toolkit about headers. So in our conferences this week, we are making sure that you have subject headings. They are visual cues in your paper that make it a lot easier for your reader to understand when you're making some rhetorical moves and shifts in your paper. They help identify the main points that you're making for your reader in a very concise and succinct way. So I will be looking for subject headings in this paper. I'll also be looking for a specific title. So there's also a toolkit content page that you want to look at there. We will also be looking at formatting the works cited page. So for this paper, you want to attempt a works cited page that meets MLA guidelines. Now, we are introducing you to works cited pages at this point in the semester. You'll really spend a lot more time on that in Composition 2. But for the time being, we really want you to kind of take a stab at and make a running attempt at a works cited page, because it's kind of like you can't be able to perfect or do it perfectly, writing a works cited page, if you haven't practiced along the way. So we're practicing. You also want to format your paper for submission, and there are 2 videos also that can help you with that. But if you look at the model of my paper, the Temple Grandin paper in Google Docs, you will see that it's formatted according to MLA. And when we do our conferences this week, I also make sure that your paper is formatted according to MLA. But if you need help with that, there's also 2 videos that Jared Ince, another instructor at NCTC, was kind enough to put together. We are also going to complete a discussion on editing. We are going to complete a discussion on This I Believe essays. There's an INRW content page, an assignment assessment, and then an INRW check-in. And then finally, your rhetorical listening essay is due next Monday. Now, keep in mind that this paper is worth 20% of your grade in the course. It is important that you do your absolute best work. It's also important that you turn that paper in. There is no way that you can pass this class without turning in your rhetorical listening essay. If you don't, I'll have to drop you from the course, and I don't want to do that. That being said, right, I don't want to put pressure on you and you feel overwhelmed. So turn in your paper. That being said, you will have the opportunity at the end of the semester to come back and look at my comments and revise that paper again. Hopefully now that you'll have 5 additional weeks from when you turn it in to when the final exam is, to revise it even further and hopefully make it an even better, stronger paper. If you have any questions, remember that you can always reach out and email. Right? Bye.